Okay, why don't we get started here? If you know me, I'm a stickler for being on time. Thank you so much for joining us today for the William and Mary Summer Conservation Research presentations. My name is Robert Rose, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Integrative Conservation. We're a newly launched institute here at William and Mary. We launched in January of 2020. And our mission is to cultivate an inclusive community of creative leaders to deliver innovative solutions to the world's most pressing conservation challenges. We have really two main goals, and that is to improve conservation on the ground through collaborative research with external conservation partners and train the next generation of diverse conservation leaders. And that includes launching a new conservation major here at William and Mary. Along with the Charles Center, we launched this initiative to try to address both of those goals. So this program matched up students with conservation NGOs and some of the projects that they were interested in working on, and students developed their projects over the summer and are reporting on their work today. I want to hand it over to Dan Crystal, the Director of Undergraduate Research with the Charles Center. He wants to introduce the Charles Center to everyone.
Hello, thank you very much for coming, and I think we have a real treat ahead of us here with these 5 undergraduate research projects that we're going to hear about. The Charles Center is a place at William & Mary that directs undergraduate research and interdisciplinary work of all sorts, and I'm the Director of Undergraduate Research there, and so I was thrilled to work with the IIC to initiate the first year of this program, in which 5 very fine William & Mary students were able to do the work that you're going to hear about with NGOs that are doing really important conservation work around the world. So we look forward to more partnerships, and I just hope that you'll remember while you're watching these that this is one summer of undergraduate research, and maybe think back on your own time as an undergraduate and what you did with your summers and see if it matches up. I'm really, really impressed with the work that these students have done, and I hope you are too. Back to you, Rob.
Thanks, Dan. And I also wanted to note that also joining us is the John Swaddle. He's the faculty director of the Institute for Integrative Conservation. And Erica Garut, she's our new program manager. And they may be chiming in today. So we're going to launch into these presentations. We have 5 students presenting on their summer work. They worked with the Rainforest Trust, Wildlife Conservation Society, American Bird Conservancy, Conservation International, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we were thrilled to get a chance to partner with each of these organizations to identify these projects and then have the students working with these organizations all summer. Just some logistics for today's webinar. Each presentation will be about 12 minutes, and we'll follow that with a short question and answer session. If you do have questions, please use the Q&A button that you should see in the Zoom toolbar and type your question in. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll ask the questions to each of the panelists. We are monitoring the chat as well, so if you're having any issues with the Q&A button or hearing us, please don't hesitate to use that chat. Following the 5 presentations, we're thrilled to have Thomas Lovejoy joining us as a discussant, and he's going to talk about placing these conservation projects in the bigger conservation context. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Lauren. She's going to introduce herself and her project.
All right. So again, thank you so much for being here today and joining us. We're really excited to tell you all about our projects that we had this summer. So my name is Lauren Abderholden, and over the summer, I worked on global conservation priority setting with Rainforest Trust. And they're a nonprofit environmental organization that's committed to protecting rainforests and endangered species through international partnerships. Also, we worked with the IIC, as Rob had mentioned, and the funding for these projects comes from the Charles Center. So I want to ask a question. How do we as humans select and conserve the most important species-rich places on Earth? And how do we even think about global conservation priority setting? As humans, we really do have a critical responsibility to protect these rare and endangered species while also thinking about cost-effective and attainable land solutions. So these initial questions lead me into my research question. And that is, oops, sorry. Hold on 1 second. Yeah. So basically, where are the most important places on the globe for conservation to protect endangered and critically endangered species? Or basically, what places on Earth take priority for conservation? So there's not one universal way to think about conservation priority setting. It's very well studied, and it's pretty much an expanding field, and there's so many approaches to conservation priority setting. But some literature reads that comprehensiveness, complementarity, cost efficiency, and minimizing biodiversity loss are very important factors in conservation priority setting. Additionally, there's this idea called the conservation triage by Bottrill, and basically that's talking about an allocation of limited resources that we need to maximize our conservation returns relative to our conservation goals under this constrained budget that we have. So there's going to be inevitably some limitations with priority setting, but these kind of main ideas are what interdisciplinary conservation scientists have agreed upon. And with this in mind, I have my goal, and that is to identify the best regions on Earth to conserve endangered species and to protect habitats through complex GIS analysis. And then after that, I want to create an online interactive map that displays these results, and Rainforest Trust partners and international governments and businesses and organizations can utilize this tool. So I use the word best. So how do we define this word? So I'm using this backbone of the rarity weighted richness score. And this is a metric that shows basically the inverse size of a species range. So basically, if a species has a larger range, then it's going to have a smaller rarity weighted richness score. So based on species range alone, we can make this order of priorities saying, well, if one species has a larger range, it might have a less priority than a species that has a very fixed range. But obviously, we're not looking at one specific species in one specific place. We're doing a global analysis here. So what we needed to do is, and what I did was I split the Earth's land masses into 100 square kilometer squares and calculated a modified richness score for each square on the globe. So these scores incorporate three things. First, that rarity weighted richness score. So that's basically the inverse of the range size of each species. And I calculated that by measuring how many squares a specific species occurs in, their range. Secondly, it incorporates a species designation as either a critically endangered or endangered species. So a species that is critically endangered is going to have a higher priority over an endangered species. Lastly, the percent species range that is already protected as designated by the WDPA. So I'm looking at the percentage of the range that's unprotected, because if a species has its range more unprotected, it's going to have a higher priority over a species that has more of its range protected. So there's also a little caveat here. So basically, you can think about it, even if a species range may overlap a square, if its entire range is already protected, then that square might have a score of 0 because we're not going to invest any resources or time into that square because this range is already protected, and therefore we assume that this species is protected. So I just wanted to run through an arbitrary example that I made up. 2 squares here. The first and second square tell you about the species ranges, what species, whether they're critically endangered, and what their range size incorporates. So for the first square, we have a green turtle that's endangered, has a large range of 5,000 squares, and a scalyfoot snail, critically endangered, has a small range. On the other hand, we have square 2 has a snow leopard range that has a large range and is endangered, and a plover bird, which is endangered and has a medium range. So basically, we got to look at a couple of things. So first, both of these squares have the equal amount of species, which is checked off. If one square had more than the other, we'd probably have to look at that more deeply. But the scalyfoot snail, because it's critically endangered and has a small range, really trumps out the other species in terms of priority, and therefore square 1 would be given a higher priority than square 2 because of this snail. So just pulling back to the overview instead of getting into the methodology, there are 3 parts to this project. So first, I have to run a large analysis on global data on ArcPro, then create this interactive map, and then with science and research, you have to show your results. And by doing that, I created a standard operating procedure document for Rainforest Trust. So this is for future reference, as well as kind of a guideline for showing the reproducibility of these results and methods. So again, just like an overview of kind of the outline of what I did for this project. So first I had to collect global data sets, and in the next slide, I'll talk about specifically what data sets I used. So after that, I manipulated these data sets on ArcPro for target categories that we were interested in. And before running a global analysis, it's really important to create a subset data set so that you can finalize a methodology and run this analysis first. So then after you've finalized a small data set methodology, you can prepare for a global data set, because you don't want to get into running this analysis on a global data set, which takes a lot of time, and realizing that you might have to go back and change something about your methodology if it doesn't work. After that, you have to import these geodatabases into ArcGIS Online. So all of the information that I calculated from ArcGIS Pro went to ArcGIS Online, and then I configured the application. So for people that aren't familiar with ArcPro or ArcGIS, a geodatabase is basically like a folder that just stores a lot of information in a specific type of file. So next, I can talk about these data sets that I used. So the first one is the IUCN Red List species data. It's a polygon layer. So basically each species that was on this list has its own unique polygon and its unique ID number. And it also gives more specific information on the species itself, whether it's critically endangered, or vulnerable. And if you can see on the top right, the IUCN Red List, or the IUCN organization itself, has this kind of, it tells you the different spectrum of what these species are designated as. So I specifically looked at endangered and critically endangered species in this analysis. Second, I used the World Database on Protected Areas, which is a layer that was updated in July. It's also a polygon layer, so that means that there's specific polygons for each of these protected areas around the globe. And then from the Rainforest Trust database, I used a simple world polygon layer because I needed to split up the Earth's land masses into those squares. We weren't looking at any ocean areas. We were specifically looking at terrestrial species. So that's the last one that I used. So on the top right, that is basically a screenshot of this application. It's really exciting. It looks very complicated. So I can kind of explain what I found from this analysis and then putting it all together. So I thought it was interesting that I could talk about the different places that have this highest modified richness score. So the squares with this richness score that was the highest were found in St. Helena Island, Porto Santo Island, Seychelles, and Sri Lanka. So I have a bunch of pictures of these beautiful places that I wish I could go visit. They just look so rich and biodiverse. So I just wanted to go into one specific spot. So I'm looking at Porto Santo here. So Porto Santo Island is an island off of the coast of Portugal. Again, top right, beautiful. I wish I could go visit there. Beaches, that's like totally what I'm into. So if you look at the bottom right, this is a screenshot from that interactive map, and it shows this modified rarity weighted richness score. So I got a 45.94 richness score. And also with this table, you can see the list of species that are contributing to this score. So the scores ranged from 0 to about like 130. So this was one of the higher ones. So when I clicked on the table of species that are contributing to this richness score, I found that there were 28 species on the IUCN Red List species data list. Some of them including the green turtle, a hawksbill turtle, land snail. But one of the species that really caught my eye in this list was a Xenos petrel, which is a bird, and it's right here. So this bird species is actually endemic to this island. So that means it's only found on this island and not found anywhere else in the world. Additionally, 100% of its range is unprotected. So this shows me that not only is this species, it's contributing very heavily to this score. So it kind of, just going through a specific example kind of shows how this methodology worked and that it does make sense because this bird contributed a lot to this specific score. So lastly, I just wanted to talk about the conservation moving forward. What are the implications of this project? So again, this interactive map that I created are used by Rainforest Trust as well as their international partners. Additionally, this map is a stepping stone for more complex GIS analysis, as well as kind of a first analysis for Rainforest Trust to add more layers and more complexity to this map. It also adds a new way to think about conserving critically endangered and endangered species. So not only are we looking at the species range, but we're also looking at whether or not its range is protected, and we're also giving weight to whether it's critically endangered or endangered. Additionally, the data layers are very new. So the data layers I used were from June and July, and the IUCN and WDPA layers are being continually updated monthly. So it's really important to have this updated analysis. It includes relevant and new information. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. And I just want to take this time to thank Rainforest Trust. I worked with Aaron McCreelis and Carl Dieter, and I want to thank Robert Rose and John Swaddle for giving me this opportunity. I really learned a lot, and I had a great time working on this summer. I also want to thank the other interns. You guys definitely enriched my experience this summer at our weekly meetings. And lastly, I wanted to thank the Charles Center for their funding for this research project. So now I can take any questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was fascinating. Before we get to questions, I want to open the floor to Carl Didier from, he worked with us, he's from Rainforest Trust, to identify this project and is going to talk a little bit about Lauren's work in the project. Carl?
Oops. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I wanted to thank Lauren and IIC for all of their help over the summer. It's really been a great experience collaboratively working with you folks. It's been super easy, super fun, and as Lauren's work shows, super productive. Just a couple of words about Rainforest Trust and how Lauren's work is actually really important in very concrete ways for us. So Rainforest Trust basically tries to conserve endangered species by creating protected areas all over the planet and trying to work with organizations in different countries, especially in the developing world, to create those protected areas. we receive a lot of the money we do to create protected areas from a whole range of donors, the small donors to really big donors who give us millions of dollars. And we feel like we have a really important responsibility to spend the money of those donors well, to have the biggest impact possible for the endangered species that those donors also want to protect. So I think Aunt Lauren's work goes a really long way to helping us do that. Specifically, we're going to be using Lauren's work, her map, her application in three very specific ways. The first is what we call our project officers will actually use that map to try to find places on the planet that we think we can create protected areas. They'll say, that place on the planet got a really high score. We should go there, try to find somebody who's working on the ground who can create a protected area and work with them to do it. So that's what we call prospecting of projects, and Lauren's map will help us do that. Lauren's map is also going to be critical for helping us evaluate proposed projects that come to Rainforest Trust. So people will send in a project proposal, say, I want to protect this area. We can use Lauren's map to say, is this a really good investment? Is it worth it? Does it protect, have a lot of impact on endangered species? Or is it really not worth it from our standpoint? Because maybe there's one species there and it has a big range. That's really important. The third way we're going to use it is measuring our impact as Rainforest Trust moves through time. We can say, how many endangered species have we had an important impact on? Which ones haven't been protected at all? Maybe we should try to create protected areas to capture those species that haven't been protected. So I just wanted to demonstrate that this research is really applicable. It's really helping us spend money well. And in my opinion, every dollar that we can save by better investments that Lauren helps us do is more endangered species conserved and saved. So I just want to say super thanks to Lauren. She was amazingly independent as a collaborator with Rainforest Trust, very innovative in her approach to solving the problems, real difficult GIS problems in some places, and very creative from the standpoint of creating the application and tool that's very user-friendly and easy to understand. Thanks very much, Lauren. And thanks very much, Rob and the IIC. This has been a wonderful experience.
Thanks, Carl. And I'm going to pass it over to Erica. I think she has some questions from the audience for Lauren.
Yeah, great presentation, Lauren. So for all the participants, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the students, you just click on that Q&A button below and you can type in the questions and I'll read them. So a question for you, Lauren. This is an interesting focus on rarity as valued, thus of high priority, but rare species, because there are few of them, are unlikely to play an important ecological role. They're effectively functionally extinct. How might incorporating ecological function change your analysis?
So that's a really good question. Thank you for that. I'm trying to think. So I'm not entirely sure if there's a specific metric for ecological function to my knowledge, but I'm sure that with, some further research on the specific species that we're looking at, you could definitely incorporate that in some way. I think more of what we were trying to get at was, even though they're rare, they could be functionally extinct. We do want, that's our priority, is to save them. But yeah, I really do think that incorporating ecological function in some way, shape, or form would change the analysis, because it might place more priority on, say, endangered species versus critically endangered species or almost extinct species.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Here's another quick question. This person said, this is a really interesting project. Are there any methods you use in creating your map to heavily weight species that are more, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. It's an interesting topic. I'm wondering how you think differences in scientific effort influence the results. It's notable that the islands rated as more important are part of developing countries, but in tropical places. Sorry about that, Lauren. So yeah, the question was, how do you think differences in scientific effort may have influenced your results?
Okay, good question. What do you specifically mean by scientific effort? Sarah, I'm not sure.
I think what might be there is you can't sample the globe kind of equally, perhaps. And you might have more effort in studying one location or some species more than others. Does that influence the analysis that you would be doing here?
Well, I looked at this like a global scale. So I think we did in my methodology pretty much did go across the board. I'm not entirely sure actually. I'm a little bit confused with the question, but definitely the IUCN Red List species data set is focused on species in, tropical and like those kinds of regions, those like biodiverse regions. So I think it could play a role, but I'm not entirely sure. Yes. Thank you.
And to be totally fair, Lauren,
John.
to be totally fair, Lauren, you've been given really tough questions, globally important questions. And I think Carl wanted to add a little bit more, but you've done really well with coping with those really thorny questions about how you can go from observing, species to interpreting their function in a whole ecosystem.
Yeah,
and then also how that relates then to global patterns. These are really tough, big questions that all NGOs are kind of trying to struggle with. Yeah. Carl, do you want to add anything in terms of any of these answers?
I'll leave the functionality question for another 3-hour discussion somewhere else. The question about sampling effort, I don't remember exactly how the question was phrased, but it's a really excellent question. There are frankly places on the globe where very few people have gone, or very few scientists have gone, and the IUCN data is really bad for those places on the globe. We don't know what species are there, and many of those places are also being converted, and those species could be functionally critically endangered or endangered, and we just don't know. So actually the data set that Lauren has does not account for that. We tried to account for that in a totally different analysis. Places where we think there are endangered species, but the data don't tell us there are. So it's a great question, and it's extremely difficult to address in practice.
So I'm going to take an opportunity to ask a question that's a little more GIS focused. Given the use of spatial data here and the way you did the analysis at the kind of the unit of a pixel or the square, 1,000 square kilometer area, how do you imagine that being aggregated up to say something more about regions or biomes? Is that possible? And would that be a useful next step in terms of this analysis?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great thought. I think, so in my results, I pretty much just chose the pixels to talk about with you guys and kind of just attributed them to these specific places and locations. So I think a next step could definitely be to dissolve potentially all of the scores again to, specific, land masses or maybe even like biomes. You could do it at that level. You could do it regionally. I think that would be a really, really useful next step, actually. It could definitely broaden it. And yeah, that would be useful. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Lauren. That was really fantastic. So we're going to move on to our next presenter, Kat Bagansky. She ran an assessment of potential regional habitat in Mesoamerica for the Wildlife Conservation Society.
All right, hello. Can everyone hear me? Great. So as Rob said, hi, I'm Kat. I've been working with the Wildlife Conservation Society on a project to assess potential habitat restoration in the Mesoamerican 5 Great Forests region. So again, a quick thanks to the IIC, to the Charles Center, and of course to WCS. So I'm going to start off with a quick discussion of the goals of the project and then back up and give you some background. So our wider goals were to identify areas for restoration in the 5 Forest region. So we already know about a lot of the really high priority critical sites, such as the Rio Platano and Mayo Biosphere Reserves. But what we don't know about are all of those areas in between. And in order to make these forests stronger, we need to know all of the regions so we can fill in all of the gaps and spaces and ensure that there's no cracks forming that will weaken the forests. Our second priority is to balance human well-being with biological importance. So even though we're working for the Wildlife Conservation Society, we're not only worried about the wildlife, we're also worried about the people, the local and the indigenous communities that are living in and around the forests. So we want to know ahead of time, before we do the work on the ground, who are the relevant groups here? What are their livelihoods like? Will we be displacing them? What alternatives will be offered to them if we say this isn't sustainable, you need to do something else? So we really want to focus on that to make sure our project can benefit all parts of these ecosystems, human, animal, plant. And our third, and this is very important for a restoration project, is we want to ensure there's a lasting impact. So the way that we're going about this is by forming relationships with these local communities. So we believe that if we take a very distant approach, we plan it all from the top, say this is exactly what we're doing, go in, restore forests and leave, it's probably not going to last very long. So instead, what we want to do is make relationships with these communities, many who we already have relationships with through WCS, and work with them to find ways that they can either conserve or change their relationship with the forests so that it is mutually beneficial. So a little bit about the 5 forests. Here is a map of the 5 forests: Selva Maya, Mosquitia, Indio Mayas, Intortu, Garo, La Amistad, and Darien. So altogether, they make up about 12 million hectares of land. They have a key role for local biodiversity, flyways and resting areas for migratory birds. They support 5 million people, and are about half the lands are managed by local and indigenous communities. So unfortunately though, in the last 15 years, about a quarter of the area of these forests have been lost, mainly due to illegal cattle ranching. So there was created a 5 Great Forests Initiative. So that's a partnership between the different Mesoamerican countries, NGOs, including WCS, local and indigenous communities, and others, specifically looking to protect and preserve these forests. So why WCS? Well, WCS has over 2 decades of experience working in this area with communities, forming partnerships. We have country programs in Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and we've had previous demonstrated successes. So recently, WCS helped recover 140,000 hectares of land in the Guatemalan Mayo Biosphere Reserve. So there's already, a track record of success. Relationships have already been formed. So WCS really has a stake here. And also a quick note on what do we mean by restoration. So this can be a pretty slippery term for ecology. And I want to be clear that when I say restoration, I am using it more as an umbrella term for multiple approaches towards addressing, strengthening these forest areas. So we are going to go through and analyze the different forest areas, which we'll speak more to in a moment. And depending on what kind of ecosystem it is, what the needs are, what the strength of the forest is, we'll choose one of various different approaches. So that might be full restoration, go in, plant trees, monitor it, It might just be reforestation, a little bit less monitoring, plant trees, move on. Or we might focus on just getting the cattle or whatever other harmful things are out of there. So by restoration, I mean a variety of things, not just straight textbook restoration. So how do we choose what areas we're going to restore? This was a big discussion because it was, this is how we are setting all of our priorities and identifying what makes different forest areas valuable. So we came up with 4 main criteria that altogether comprise the potential for restoration for any given space. So these are biological importance, landscape context, sociocultural context, and feasibility and threats. So our first one is biological importance. This encompasses human footprint analysis, which was done in 2015 by WCS and the Fish and Wildlife Service to assess what kind of impact humans have had on Mesoamerica. We are using that in combination with distribution layers for 5 key species that are they are landscape species, species that WCS has focused on in the past, and they're charismatic. So they're easy to gain interest and support for protecting. So these are, of course, jaguar, most importantly, white-lipped peccary, harpy eagle, scarlet macaw, and Bart's tapir. Second, we have landscape context. So this criterion is made up of 2 different factors, percent forest cover and land use. So together, these metrics help us identify what the relative strength and potential for new forests there is. So we want to identify those areas that are forest, were recently forest, were historically forest, and where they are close by to intact forests. So together, these 2 metrics give us an idea of what are our limited range of places we could approach for restoration, because we don't want to go into ecosystems that were not historically forested. We don't want to force a forest on prairie lands or anything else. So it's good to have an understanding of what the lands are. Third, we have sociocultural context. So this is made up of the location of traditional indigenous lands and preserves, as well as the location of community managed areas. And third, a selection of different protected area types, such as World Heritage Sites. So these are going to be areas that it will be easier to enter and do restoration, reforestation work in, because there's already systems to protect them. Finally, this is our 4th category, feasibility and threats. So this category is probably the hardest to define of all 4. So feasibility and threats is made up of a lot of things. So rate of fire, rate of deforestation, local institutional capacity, what funding is available, what ongoing projects there are. So this tries to give us an idea of, separate from the relative importance of a site, how possible is it to do restoration there? Because we don't want to go in and make big investments in a place that's either highly prone to fire or where there is no power for local enforcement of restoration efforts. We really want to put our time, our effort into those areas where we know restoration will be successful and will have a lasting impact. So we came upon a problem when we were gathering data for these criteria where there were clear holes. So, like I just said, feasibility and threats, not super easy to define. Our options are either take all these various data layers that make it up and try to quantify them somehow, or find a different way to represent it. Similarly, with species data, we tried to use the IUCN data as Lauren did, but we found that for our specific species, it just wasn't quite good enough. It wasn't as accurate to the site level as we needed it to be, and it was a little out of date. So to fill in these gaps, I had to find a way for all of our experts at WCS to collaborate on maps, perhaps in real time, so that we could pool all of the expert knowledge and quickly and easily get new, updated maps, dense with information, and as accurate as they could be. So I started using ArcGIS Online web apps, again, like Lauren did. And so this is one of the maps that we did for feasibility. This is the second for species mapping. And so these maps, these are in progress pictures of the maps. They are the product of collaboration between myself, the different country directors for the Mesoamerican programs, and various other interested parties. So here we have feasibility defined as high, medium, and low, based on the subjective opinion of our experts. You know, they consider a certain site and can consider, you know, what is the fire regime like here? What ongoing efforts are there? How far away from the roads is this area to be able to bring equipment in? And we trusted them to define the feasibility of the given sites. So this is again an in-progress picture. Our hope for a final product is to have a full mosaic of a 15-kilometer buffer around each of the forests so that we can go through and pick out, here are all of the places where restoration is most likely to be successful. For the species, here I have shown 2 of our 5 key species. This is the polygons shown here are all input by one person. And so these were made using the IUCN data as well as a 2016 WCS white-lipped peccary distribution map as the background. And I asked all of our participants to go through, fill in the blanks, change what they think is wrong, and just give us more accurate maps. You know, we started out with maps maybe from the IUCN that just kind of showed a broad swath all over Mesoamerica. You could find Bart's tapir. And the experts were saying, no, that's actually not true. Here are all these areas where they're extinct. Here's where they actually are. So this will give us, once we have all of the, all 5 species represented, this will give us a quick and easy way to say, here are those areas where the greatest number of our priority species are. And here's a way to show for this one criteria where the most important areas are. Once data are made parallel, I will go through and do something called a suitability analysis through GIS. So basically what will happen is I'll take all of the sub-criteria, all of the criteria, and basically sum them up for each and every cell in the map. And so you'll be able to, you know, point to a very specific cell in Honduras, Guatemala, and say, here is the overall restoration score of this cell. And so it'll be a whole web of different areas where you can say, here's restoration is really possible here, it's less possible here. But that's not going to be the end point. Once I've created that map, it'll be a starting point for a discussion for everyone to get back together again and subjectively look at it and say, here's the places that scored the highest, but here's the ones that we think go the best together. Here's the ones that we think will have the greatest impact on existing forests. So those final decisions will be incorporated in a restoration strategy report. So this is the second product of my work. This I will be beginning later in the fall. And the restoration strategy report is more of a public-facing product. So it will include background information about the region, the climate, the different kinds of ecosystems there are. It will include information about the model, what the final results were, what areas it pointed to focus on. It will include different case studies. So choosing certain areas, you know, such as the Mayo Biosphere Reserve, but also places that are identified by the model and giving like a little profile on each of them. So here's the spot. Here are the types of work that we could do here: restoration, removal of cattle, introduction of cacao agroforestry. And then a third part of the strategy report, which we think is very important to include, is a list of ongoing projects as well as funds where money can actually be acquired to do this work. So altogether, the strategy report gives us, number one, a way to continue the work. I'm a senior. I'm graduating soon. I'm going to be moving on to a new place. So this will give us a way to pass on all of the work in one product in a way that's easily able to be understood and get yourself caught up on what's happened so far. And it will also give us things to present to donors, you know, the case studies, specific areas to say, here is what we've identified as a need, and here's how you can help. Sorry. So here's a list of the specific outcomes of my work. So my analysis, I've created an integrated analysis of the 5 forests through my GIS, something that incorporates the 4 different criteria to give a more holistic view of what's the most important. I've also identified accessible tools for collaboration. So the web apps, I've written up an instruction book on how to use and how to create new web apps so that it's now a tool that WCS can use going forward to aid with data collection, collaboration, map making, in a way that even people who don't have a lot of experience with GIS can help out and share their knowledge. And the third concrete outcome of my work will be these focused requests for donors that will come from the strategy report. The broader outcomes of my work, once everything is said and done, this will help to protect and strengthen the 5 forests. WCS fully intends to use this work and help put it towards another ongoing project with funding from the UN to go through and do restoration work in the region. So this will also help combat global deforestation. As many of us know, deforestation is a real problem, and it's only going to get worse as the climate worsens. Third, the workflow I've identified through my geoanalysis could potentially be applied to new and different contexts. So, you know, say there's another area where a group wants to do restoration in a different part of the world or in a different part of Latin America. They could potentially take these steps that I've put together, the different kinds of data that I've incorporated, and modify it to do an analysis of their focus area. And fourth, this work will help the countries in Mesoamerica to meet their climate commitments. So each has committed through COP25 and various other programs and agreements to help fight climate change using their forests. So by helping to restore the 5 forests, we're helping these countries to meet their commitments. That's everything that I have. I want to give a special thanks to my partners at WCS, Jeremy and Alexa. I have loved working with you, and I'm looking forward to working with you still through the fall. I'd also like to thank Victor Hugo Ramos and John Polisar, neither who are here, but who were great help in assembling the data for this project, and the rest of the WCS Mesoamerica team for their interest and for their assistance. I'd also like to thank Rob Rose and the IIC, and Dan Crystal and the Charles Center for all of your support with this work. And yeah, that's it from me. I'd love to answer some questions.
Thank you, Kat. That was fantastic. Before we get to questions, I'm going to pass it over to Jeremy Radichowski from Wildlife Conservation Society for a few comments.
Great. Thanks, Rob, and thanks very much, Kat. Beautiful presentation. I just want to thank you again. Thanks to Kat, thanks to Rob, thanks to IIC and William and Mary. I'll just say that, you know, we came to William and Mary with a real conservation problem. We're committed to conserving Mesoamerica's last large forests, these 5 great forests. And as Kat mentioned, they've been under severe pressure and degradation due to cattle ranching especially. And then half of these areas are managed by local people, indigenous or community managers. So it's very, very important as well to support conservation, but also to support local development. And one of the areas that we really needed some help with was kind of defining our strategy towards restoration. So again, we came with a real world problem, and essentially, you know, Kat has worked with us almost as a consultant would to kind of walk through the entire process of defining and developing the logic, and then pushing through the entire analysis, but also the kind of consultative and social process that I think is inherent in any kind of complex conservation problem. And especially, I'll say, in times of COVID, you know, the tools that she's brought for joint conservation thinking and mapping have been really useful. We were talking with Rob about how we used to draw things with acetate and then digitize them later on, and how far we've come to be able to collaboratively map now. So I'll just say that you know, we've actually learned plenty of things from Kat. The analysis is not an academic exercise, but rather will be implemented. It's something that, you know, we're doing both to, again, kind of plug in those holes, restore the 5 forests, but in a special way that really focuses on maintaining their intactness and also the social benefits in both protecting land tenure and protecting local communities. And so I'd also just like to say, for IIC, I think that this model of integrated conservation, especially at the undergraduate level, is really unique and really powerful as well. And I think it's something that, you know, in your first year, I'd just like to congratulate you again, Rob, as well as the entire team. I think it's a really wonderful model, and you're really pushing the envelope in terms of, you know, integrating conservation into undergraduate education in a real and practical way. So thanks once again, Kat, Rob, IIC, William & Mary, for all of your support. And again, thanks as well for volunteering to continue beyond the summer to finish up these analyses and the reports. We're going to use them, and we're going to hopefully help to change the world in a positive way, thanks to you. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to WCS. And I want to pass it over to Erica for a couple questions.
All right, Kat, so there's been a lot of good discussion and questions about politics. So presumably local governments probably vary quite a bit in their receptivity to restoration. We're wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you embedded politics into your thinking, or ideas for next steps into how you could include that in your mapping.
Yeah, so political climate is one of the many things that falls under feasibility and threats for this assessment. So there's no good and easy way to, you know, create a data layer that shows the relative political acceptance. It's not something that exists. And, you know, I think it's pretty obvious, a lot of us, that doing any sort of conservation work in Mesoamerica is not going to be easy, and in places like Nicaragua is not going to be popular. So political climate is one of the things that we asked our experts to take in mind when they were drawing their polygons for the collaborative map. So no, there's no data layer that I can point to being incorporated, but yes, it is a consideration, and definitely an important one, because it'll have impacts on, you know, how long-term the success of these projects are, and also the availability for funding and support for actually going forward with the work.
Awesome. And the next question is a little bit about next steps. So as far as, you know, as after WCS uses this tool, do you see this as being an iterative approach, where potentially after they implement restoration, that they could use that information learned to inform this model? And what's your opinion on sort of next steps to make this effort continuous and applicable?
Yeah, so we are just beginning the modeling aspects of this project, but our intent with doing the modeling is that we would form it in a way, I know there's another question about weighting the data. Yes, the data will be weighted. We want to build the model in a way that we can go through and edit the way everything has been weighed, so that as we get different opinions on the final map that is created, we can adjust them. And so that certainly can apply later down the road after work has begun. You know, we're not going to restore all 5 forests all at once. Work is going to be done little by little. So as projects go forward, definitely it would be possible to go back to this original model and tweak it to, you know, make it more accurate or better suited to the actual conditions.
Thank you, Kat. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next presentation. Kat, that was a fantastic job. And if there are additional questions for Kat, we'll have our email address at the end, and we'll be happy to pass any questions on to Kat that she could answer. So next we're going to hear from Sidonie Horn. She was working on a spatial analysis of Global Alliance for Zero Extinction sites for the American Bird Conservancy. Sidonie?
Hi, I'm Sidonie Horn, and I was working with the American Bird Conservancy to conduct a spatial analysis of Alliance for Zero Extinction sites. The American Bird Conservancy is dedicated to conserving wild birds and their habitats in the Americas, and this project was through the International Division, which is also just working on the Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, which are global. So I just wanted to give a broad overview of what my project was. My goal was to create a tool that would allow us to easily visualize change to AZE sites over an extended time period. And I particularly wanted to visualize changes of human-driven activity, such as change in land cover and land use, deforestation, population changes, and then the legal protected status to the areas around these AZE sites. The goal of having this tool would be that partner organizations outside of ABC and unrelated to AZ would be able to quickly look at a site that they're interested in protecting, or an AZE site they're interested in potentially, and kind of see what the past conservation efforts could have been, and like what changes have occurred in this area over time that might be influencing the future success of potential projects that would be implemented. So here's the panda, which not as particular species that I worked with, but one of the big issues in conservation is that there is limited funding and resources for conservation projects, and one of the popular examples is the focus on charismatic megafauna getting a lot of resources. And that was kind of the idea behind this project and creating this tool, was that when you have limited resources for sites, it would be a beneficial goal for conservation projects to pick areas that will be successful over time. And some of the things that could trigger those ideas of success are what is going around these areas. If you're trying to preserve an area in a rapidly growing city, that might take a lot more resources to maintain than somewhere in a less urban environment where you can more easily maintain and conserve this area. So AZE sites overall are already recognized as important key areas of conservation and places to focus on, but there are still 859 of them, so that you would still want to cut that down to more key sites. And just a quick summary of how these sites are developed. There's more details in how they're given these designations, but basically they are sites that contain at least one endangered or critically endangered species, where most of that species resides only in this area for a significant portion of its life history, and the area that they reside in is definable, and it's a place where you could easily say, this is where we want to conserve the species. The AZ sites work towards the goals 11 and 12, the HG biodiversity targets, which are towards protecting areas and preventing extinction. Since this is a global effort, I wanted to create maps on a global scale, and which led to the work that I did over the summer. Most of what I did focused on gathering data and cleaning that data, just because it is hard to find data sets that are good at a global scale. Since we wanted to compare the sites to each other, we wanted to be using the same data for every single site. So I ended up finding creating layers for change in population, land cover, and protected areas. And we're still working on a deforestation layer because that data is very good, but it's been very difficult to deal with on such a large scale. And I kind of just want to go through this map with you. I think that's the best way to illustrate what I did. So basically overall with these 3 layers, we wanted to show the % change in population around each AZ site, the change in land cover, which we wanted to specifically focus on the change to natural landscape and change from natural landscape, and also the change in the legal protected areas, which is taken from the IUCN protected areas. So you have this interactive map, and you can you can go through the two different layers that you're seeing. One of them, the purple filled in one, is the actual area of the AZE site. The border around it includes a 10-kilometer buffer, which is what all the analysis was done on, since it's not, we wanted to also look at the things going around each sites when you think about conserving these sites. And so that was important to see what was going on the edges. When you select one, it'll bring up this summary of the relevant statistics. It gives you the country, the name of the site, and the area, and then the different changes that would be relevant. So if you wanted to look at a site, you would just select it, and then you can kind of see how much that's changed over time in population, land cover, and protected status. So this gives you a good summary of the changes, but I also wanted to be able to visually show on a more specific level where is population changing around these sites, and also where is the land cover changing. Unfortunately, like I've said, this is a really big data set, and that was hard to put on ArcGIS Online for the entire world, but it's really easy to select the edited data as just separate countries and put that into an interactive map. So I have more layers. Oh. No. Okay, so you can pull up the legend here. I'm just going to go ahead and turn off some of these. And if you have the link to this map, this is something that can be used by anyone. It's public, and you can go ahead and edit. If you want to still see the data for various layers, but you don't want to see them on the map, you can make them transparent. And so with something like this, you still, when you press on it, will get all the summary data for every statistic, but you can also visually see where the differences are. So the gray would be areas that have gone from natural to developed. And as you click through the different panels, it will highlight those different attributes. And then this would be the same thing, but this is just the changes in population. And part of the reason it's so large is the population data we got is sorted at a district level. So it summarizes it based on that. So it is not super specific. So in conclusion, I ended up creating two maps that are a good first step in selecting sites for conservation, and it can be easily used if you have a site in mind, you just wanted to get some quick background information on what's been going on in that area and kind of have an idea of what you have to work with. Ideally, this type of tool will help emphasize a long-term vision in conservation projects, as since it's using data from a longer period of time, additional things would be tracked for a longer period of time as well. And since I spent a lot of time with data cleaning and figuring out how to get the large data sets to work, I would like to do some more analysis using these tools in the future. A couple of thoughts that we've had, we're looking at seeing exactly how accurate this map is. Again, since it's on a global scale, we had to we're more limited in what data sets we could use. So we'd like to see if you were looking at a country that perhaps has its own layer for land cover, to compare the differences between the changes in land cover using the country's data and using this map to just see how accurate this is on a smaller scale. And also explore the other ways that this could be used for priority setting, including more history of conservation efforts in each site within the pop-up data sets. I wanted to thank the IIC and Rob Rose for coordinating this program and the Charles Center for funding it. And I also really appreciate the opportunity to work with ABC, and especially Amy Upgren and David Weidenfeld for always being available for questions and helping me with this project.
Thank you, Sabine. That was fantastic, and I applaud your willingness to try a live demo during a talk. Not many people try that. Before we go to questions, I want to invite Amy Upgren to unmute if you want to say anything about this project from the American Bird Conservancy perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Absolutely. First of all, it was great to work with you all at William and Mary, and it was especially great to get to know and work with Sidoni. She did a fantastic job. We were all very impressed with how much she was able to take this project on and work independently throughout the summer, and we're happy to continue to work with her this fall. Her project is something that we've been interested in doing for a while and just haven't really had the time to get to, or the GIS expertise that she has to actually do some of these analyses and use these large data sets like she was talking about. She persevered when different data challenges arose, and this is going to be very useful. We'll be using this really right now for some of these sites and some of the projects that we're doing in some of the key countries that she's put data together for. So we will be using her analyses now, and as we work with her this fall on additional research using the work that she's already done, I know that those will also be really applicable to our work. So we're very grateful for all her good efforts.
Thank you, Amy. And before we get to other questions, I had one because it occurred to me as you were going through your presentation, and it's kind of burning with me. Given, you know, these sites really well, these AZE sites and their distribution, and all the analysis was done sort of at a site level. I'm wondering what the value is, or if there's a value in looking at these across a broader landscape. So instead of treating these as individual sites, is there some conservation outcome that works a little bit better when you start thinking as a collection of sites that are within some proximity of each other?
I think that could be valuable. And there are places, as you know, in the world where there are sort of a set of sites within a larger landscape area. And that could definitely be something worth exploring.
I think that would be useful in this, especially in like the South American countries where you have a lot clustered. And I think some areas like Europe and the US don't have as many. It might not work.
Excellent. Erica, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, Sidoni, you now have had a lot of time working with this very useful tool that can obviously be applied at a landscape level and at a site level. I'm wondering if you have any ideas or suggestions on how to train practitioners on how to use this, since you've had so much time working with it.
I think just spending time with the web app. I think for me, especially if I wanted to look at it more closely, and when I was creating it, there was one site that I would use the whole time to like kind of see what my edits were doing, and to like kind of understand what the data was showing. So I think in terms of like people getting used to using that application or editing it for their own uses, having a specific site to work with is as like a project area would be most beneficial than trying to look at it all at once.
And I think since you've had an opportunity now, as Rob said, to look, to really dig into this data, are there any specific questions or priorities that you see?
I haven't actually, I didn't get as much time as I'd wanted to look at specifically each site and really compare them to each other, just because it was so large and trying to get the analysis to run. But I've definitely, I looked at a lot of the ones in the smaller map that I brought up, and there's definitely like in, I think it was Chile, like there's no protected, like federally protected areas covering those sites, like compared to Costa Rica or Colombia, which has a lot more protected areas. And I think like looking more into those differences and like looking more closely into the differences of additional protected area status contributing to the like other changes of the sites would be interesting.
Great, thank you so much, Sidoni. I think we're going to move on to our next speaker now. Up next is Lauren Kohut. I actually should note that this is a project that Lauren identified and got together all on her own with no help from the IIC. She was she was fantastic in terms of identifying opportunity with Fish and Wildlife Service. And so she's going to be presenting on an analysis and visualization of migratory bird hunting data that she completed for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service this summer. Lauren?
So as Professor Rose said, my name is Lauren Kohout, and I will be discussing the work I did with U.S. Fish and Wildlife's Migratory Bird Program this summer. I worked with 3 main advisors who are part of their branch of monitoring and data management, and we worked with data from their annual hunter surveys to create some visualizations which hopefully engage hunters and also inform conservation efforts through harvest management. First, just some very quick background on myself. I'm a biology major, data science minor, senior here, and at the moment I'm really interested in conservation and ecological topics and how they can be explored using data science. All right, diving in, as I mentioned, I am working with data from their annual hunter surveys, and there are multiple reasons why Fish and Wildlife sends these surveys out to hunters. The first is that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act requires Fish and Wildlife to monitor the take or harvest of migratory birds by hunting. And the harvest surveys monitor 5 species groups that are hunted in the US, which are waterfowl, doves, woodcock, cranes, and then rails and coots. So there are other birds hunted, but since they're not considered migratory birds, such as turkeys, their management is a responsibility of the states. Secondly, we monitor the harvest of these species, how many hunters hunt them, and how many days they hunt to estimate harvest and hunter activity throughout the US. And for some species, such as rails, there is not as much information on population status, so it's especially important to monitor their harvest, as the data will in turn help inform whether conservation efforts are needed. And there are many different uses of this data beyond the setting of annual hunting regulations. That is one of the main uses of this data. So first, harvest survey data are input into population models to predict the level of harvest that is sustainable for migratory bird populations each hunting season. And this is a very scientific process that's called adaptive harvest management, which determines hunting season lengths and also bag limits. Secondly, the distribution of waterfowl harvest and population by county helps inform which refuges should be approved to acquire more land, and refuges are federally protected land for the purpose of conservation. Likewise, assessing waterfowl distribution can inform habitat prioritization and also conservation efforts on different landscapes. And lastly, nonprofit groups and academic researchers use demographic data from these surveys to investigate the human dimensions of conservation, such as how far hunters go to hunt and spatial relationships between conservation and hunting pressure. So now to give you a better idea of the sampling methods and what these data actually look like, the agency relies on 2 main surveys, and there is the diary survey and the parts collection survey. So first we have the diary survey, which is completed by more than 100,000 sampled hunters in 49 states. And this survey is mailed out each year to hunters and then asked to be returned to Fish and Wildlife. Some hunters provide daily harvest of waterfowl that they hunted along with the county, but this specificity of the data isn't required. So other hunters may only report the total number of ducks or geese shot over the entire season. So there is some inconsistency with how specific this data is. This here is a screenshot of a summary of the diary survey. So it includes the sum of the number of hunters, number of days hunted, and ducks harvested for each county for each season. Then we have the parts collection survey, which is a smaller survey completed by around 20,000 quote unquote successful hunters, which is determined by the previous year's data. And these hunters are actually asked to send Fish and Wildlife a wing of every duck that they harvest. Biologists collect these wings and then speciate age and sex each wing during what they call wing bees. And these wings can be used to calculate species composition ratios. And at the state level, these ratios have been used to estimate species-specific harvest rather than just general waterfowl harvest. But the data at the moment is quite limited for calculating species harvest at the county level, which we'll discuss a bit later. So right now there are currently 3 visualizations featured on Fish and Wildlife's National Migratory Bird Harvest Survey website, which visualize different aspects of these 2 data sets. And I'm going to pull this up now. So these are the main tools made available to hunters to understand and understand the use and extent of these data that they provide. So first, right now there's this map which shows state level summary statistics, and it's interactive, so you can go through, and these are just general waterfowl statistics that come straight from that diary survey data. And there's also, this next graphic shows timing of harvest throughout the season. And it's by region. So this one, you select a region and it shows how waterfowl harvest changes over time. And lastly, there's this choropleth map at the county level, which shows the county's waterfowl harvest rank in relation to others. And so this is, you can zoom in and out and select counties, and it says where that county ranks in relation to other counties in the state and the country. And then you also can toggle between duck and goose hunting, which have very different distributions. And so one of my projects was updating these 3 visuals that are on the website. But then the largest portion of my internship was further exploring the data to see what questions we can ask, and then working to create new visuals to add to the website or create new web pages that hopefully tell interesting stories for hunters and the general public. So why and how are we trying to improve these survey visuals? The main hope for these new maps is to give back to hunters for their participation in these surveys and encourage them to continue to participate in something that is beneficial to migratory bird conservation. We want to impress on them that this survey is worth their time and that it's really important that that they participate. In order to complete that above goal, we attempt to think from the hunter perspective as best we can. I am not a hunter, and so this was very difficult to put myself in that mindset a bit, to understand how we can manipulate the data or show the data that would be of use to them. And they also can give comments in the survey, which help us better understand sort of their questions or thoughts throughout the hunting season. So over the next several slides, I'll go into the techniques I applied and the metrics we looked into visualizing. We went down many, many different avenues and rabbit holes, and we still have a list of different possibilities for future directions. First, one thing we knew we wanted to look at was we wanted to investigate shifts throughout the season, which hadn't been explored yet in these data. The diary survey also has a variable for hunters to specify which month they harvested birds in, and sometimes this is left blank, which limits our sample size. To account for this, these maps are a 10-year average of the data. All of the subsetting and organization was done in R, and these were made in ArcGIS Pro on the desktop. And the maps I worked on were at the county level. However, we did end up applying this 200 square kilometer grid over the US. So you can see these aren't county boundaries, they're made up of grid cells. And this was because counties differ greatly in size. And so this was an effort to apportion harvest to more equal spatial units. And now I'm going to show you this animation that goes through waterfowl harvest over the course of this hunting season, which is September through February. So this is September on the screen now, and the areas in darker red are high waterfowl harvest, whereas yellow is low waterfowl harvest, and gray is where we don't have any data. So here's September, October, November, December, January, February. And you can see this expected shift in waterfowl harvest south as we get into the winter to the Gulf Coast region. Okay, and this is another animation I made, so further exploring this month, the data broken down by month. This, however, looks into hunter count, so the number of hunters in each county. Here is September. Oh, it's going to restart in a bit. September, October, November, December, January, February. And again, it mimics the waterfowl harvest trend as it moves south in the winter. So next, we use diary survey data some more to explore metrics that represent hunter success. And first, we calculated success at the county level by dividing harvest by the number of hunters, resulting in this harvest per hunter metric. And this map answers the question of where hunters would want to go in order to be most successful on average throughout the whole season. We also, however, looked into using the metric harvest per total days, which would tell us what the average harvest would be expected in 1 day of hunting. So the patterns are really similar for both hunting success metrics, but the left emphasizes seasonal success, while the one on the right emphasizes daily success. And there are some differences that you can notice that you can see in, for example, in the Southeast or central US, such as Texas and the Dakotas here, the orange turns more into a red in the daily success map, which represents maybe a relatively higher daily success compared to seasonal success, which can also relate to the season lengths, which are different throughout the US. So these maps, those were all created with the daily diary survey data, but next I looked more into the parts collection survey, which provides species-specific information. So this is a map of the 5-year average mallard species composition, which is calculated by dividing the number of mallard wings submitted to the survey divided by the total number of wings for that county. And so the coloring on this map then represents a proportion where the areas in darkest red are 100% all of the wings collected were mallard, whereas the areas in yellow, there were fewer mallards relative to all of the wings collected. And our initial hope was to be able to provide species level harvest estimates by combining this information, this species composition information, with harvest estimates. However, you can see that compared to the previous diary survey maps, there's a lot more gray in the PCS data where we don't have any data. So this highlights a limitation to give us species-specific harvest on a much finer spatial scale. And these are 2 additional species composition maps using the PCS data. On the left is blue wing and cinnamon teal, and these are grouped together because their wings are indistinguishable from one another, which I thought was really interesting. And this map on the right shows distribution of northern pintail throughout the US. And these maps are also useful for the service in better understanding distribution of migratory bird species in non-breeding seasons. So we hope that these graphics will give hunters a more complete picture of what information they're providing and see that it's helpful beyond just informing regulations, but also conservation. And the main takeaways were the importance of understanding and exploring all of the data we receive. And by knowing what data we have and what data we lack, we can better format and update these surveys to increase the quality and amount of data we receive. Lastly, it's important to keep in mind the purpose of these visuals. Our maps are not a scientific conclusion by any means. The purpose was to engage an audience and hopefully tell an interesting story using these data. We also want to ensure that the visuals match with hunter notions of what is happening with migratory birds and hunting so that they trust what they're contributing to. And lastly, just these are some of my more personal takeaways from this internship. I learned so much, but one of the main things is that data is messy. But by digging through the mess, we can gather a better understanding of what data is usable and what may need to be changed or changed to improve data quality. And secondly, with my group of mentors, I was able to see the different thought processes and knowledge bases each person brought to the table. And so it was extremely helpful to be a part of that collaboration and decision-making process for the project each week. Lastly, it is easy to get lost sometimes staring at the data all day. And I learned that it's important to remind yourself of the big picture and keep reminding yourself of the context and what the data actually mean and refer to. And I'd just like to end with a big thank you to Fish and Wildlife, my mentors, Kathy, Nate, and Emily. I'd also like to thank Professor Rose and Professor Swaddle for including me in this group of students conducting research. Thank you to the IIC and the Charles Research Center, and for you all for attending and listening to what we've been up to. And so with that, I would love to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I apologize. I don't know the Fish and Wildlife collaborators, so I can't invite somebody to speak. If someone's here, please let me know and we'll give you a chance after the questions. I will note one thing that I'm really pleased about in terms of all these projects, and something I heard from the students and the point you brought up about data being messy. I often say when I teach GIS that 80% of what you do in a GIS is get data ready for analysis. And I think with students going through these projects, they finally believe me. And I've been finally proven right once in my career when it came to something I said in the classroom. So thank you all for that. I'm going to pass it over to Erica for some questions.
Awesome, great job, Lauren. So we've all been really impressed that this data was generated by volunteer hunters. And we're wondering if you could talk a little bit about some potential bias in the data or limitations of the data. And if you think there are limitations, what would be some strategies that could be used to validate the data or account for those biases?
Sure. Yeah, that was a big discussion throughout all of the maps we made, is what is this actually telling us? And then what is the sampling bias because of who is participating? There's a lot of discussion on, I mentioned how some hunters only provide county level data or compared to state level data. And so it might be people who are more avid hunters that want to participate and provide more data. So if we're relying on this specific data and just sort of discounting the other data, then it might be skewed to people who hunt more often. And I think a way to tackle that issue, it is in a work in progress. Right now, the surveys are all being mailed out and then received back by mail. So that obviously leads to a lot of issues with also just writing in data, and then it's very time consuming taking that data and putting it into the computer. But they are in the process of making this survey online. And so it is like the second season, I believe, that they're rolling this out to a certain number of hunters. And I think that's gonna help in a lot of ways in making fields required, and then also having everything in the same data type, and there's no issue in reading numbers that people wrote. So I do think that that is going to help a lot. And also better understanding who is responding and who is participating in the data.
Great. And another question is, as a data scientist, how does seeing the data on a map help you understand the changes in species or hunters over time?
That's a great question. I'm definitely a visual person, and so anytime I'm able to look at a map rather than numbers in like a data table, I think it makes a lot more sense to me. It might not be for everyone, but I think in general, maps are more intuitive, and especially with like the coloring on the map. And I think for trying to show, sorry, I had another thought that distracted me. So The data is made available for hunters and everyone, but right now it's just in these table formats, and it's pages and pages of this annual report that they put together from this hunter survey data. And so that is available, but I'm sure not many people are looking through it. And so I think this is a much better way to engage in what they're contributing to, and they can actually sort of see analysis and efforts that can be done. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was fantastic. So now we're going to move on to our final presentation of the day. Vince Tandaw worked with Conservation International to develop a fine-scale layer of sub-Saharan water projects. Vince?
My name is Vince, and this semester, I had a great opportunity to work with Conservation International on a project of theirs with collaborators from the City University of New York and from Stanford. I also like to thank the Charles Center as well for making this happen, as well as my team from the Institute of the Integrative Conservation. So my work this summer saw me extract, pre-process, and enhance databases on water management systems in sub-Saharan Africa to create a fine layer database of geospatial information that is both informative and user-friendly for the other researchers further afield in the research pipeline. Coming from Indonesia, I am quite aware of the intersections between water management and economics. The society cannot thrive without water security, but who doesn't want financial security? This is a picture of Derawan, one of my favorite dive spots in Indonesia. Here, mangroves have been cut all over the island to create ports and hotels, creating more economic prosperity, but at the expense of the environment upon which their prosperity was based. Highly unsustainable. I'm also acutely aware of its intersection with poverty. This is a picture taken in our capital city of Jakarta, where I come from. That someone as blessed as I am shares the same space as people living in such difficult conditions is jarring. So how do the less fortunate deal with environmental, financial, and water security? How do all of us deal with this problem? I think the world must transition to water management systems that provide both water security without destroying the environment or stifling economic growth. A blend of human-built gray infrastructure, think of cement or concrete, like dams and river canals, and nature-provided green infrastructure, like watersheds and floodplains. A hybrid approach is larger than the sum of its parts. Gray infrastructure tends to be expensive, both due to its costs and also under projections thereof. Destructive towards the environment, as gray infrastructure tends to be too rooted in economic analysis. So variables that cannot be quantified easily are often left alone, and inflexible in that when the needs of the society that created them change, they are left with nothing more than obsolete concrete obelisks. Well, what's so bad about green infrastructure? Well, it's perceived as ineffective and unproven, as it is difficult to quantify its effects. A hybrid system can be sustainable for generations, considered in that it acknowledges and leverages the importance of the environment, and inclusive in that these systems often are structured from the bottom up. First evaluating what a community needs, and then creating what needs to be created. So an example of a hybrid green-gray system is something like a mangrove forest / sea dike coastal protection system, which Conservation International has implemented in Vietnam as well as in the Philippines. Conservation International has also created a watershed bank in which residents of Bogota, like a checkings account, can withdraw water. So this semester, my work for Conservation International represents a key step in information extraction and processing of researching these water management systems as part of our struggle against climate change. So I took water management financing datasets from 2 datasets already created by William & Mary's own Global Research Institute. The first dataset was their informative project on collecting World Bank financing projects in Africa. And the second was their exemplary work tracking down Chinese financing in Africa. Using some Python, humor, and a lot of snack and walk breaks, I wrote scripts that engineered these data sets, abiding by tidy data practices and general principles on data management to optimize what I had. I cleaned up data I didn't need. I reorganized, melting, pivoting the data set to make its insights clearer for other people. I enhanced usability by scraping project descriptions off the World Bank in their API and found that adding them to the database was useful so that researchers can know exactly what a particular point was on the map. They could just read the descriptions. And so they can classify them based on their attributes. For the geeks who enjoy walls of code, this is for you. I applied what I learned in class, thank you professors, and researched more methods on my own. For example, I used an algorithm that helps detect important words in every abstract that I scraped to aid in my classification of parameters. That's the code on the left. On the right is a highlight of my coding summer's experience. I put a wrong hyperparameter in my scraper, and I got my IP temporarily banned from the World Bank servers because I scraped it too often. This is why I wasn't able to get that A last semester in coding. But this is a snippet of a nearly finished data set. We have IDs on many different projects. There are precision scores, some more details like place name, lat and long, which is among the most important data points here because it's a geospatial database, descriptions for each project, and the machine learning algorithm that helps in classifying. We ended up using a supervised keyword search method, but this nonetheless helped inform the decision we made moving forward. I was also able to use some higher resolution imagery. Some of the project locations in the dataset were imprecise simply because they were unavailable. So the researchers at the Global Research Institute would code them up, we say, to the center of the nearest village or settlement and say, well, this thing is around here. And to improve precision, because we wanted it at pinpoint locations, I tried using high resolution imagery from Planet, a service that provides educators and students access to some very good aerial imagery. Remote sense from a multitude of satellites. Unfortunately, I came into some problems. These high-res imagery was not as high-res as I wanted. Other times the clouds were in the way. But luckily, these imprecise projects that we were looking at were far and few in between. So we were able to use the majority of our data. That was useful. And at the end of the day, we were able to continue with the results we had. I was able to distill some 6,500 rows into just over 3,000 important rows, from some 23 columns to just 6 to 8, depending on the data we needed. And from there, the classification would allow researchers to parse out and classify the data further for their own needs. Thus, my work over the summer was ultimately improving upon a subset of my supervisor's data. On the left is a map of all water-related data projects in the GRI datasets. And to the right is a summary, a graphical summary of the work I did over the summer. These points have improved geolocation, they've been classified, and hopefully by these properties, they have been increased in their usability for future researchers. Indeed, I'm only a small part in the larger consortium of researchers that research this green-gray infrastructure implementation. For example, a colleague of mine, Kayla, is already using my data in our project of trying to find links and correlations between all of these projects and other important indicators that relate to many other things. Catalyzing future research, branching off into the unknown has always been the goal of this project, if you will. So in closing, water security remains the Damocles sword that looms over so many heads of all people around the world. Its implications are legion, from environmental issues to social justice to economic prosperity. For us to solve this issue, we must have a geospatial understanding of what we already have and plan around it, taking into consideration not just profit incentives, but also the environment and social welfare. In all this, green-gray water management systems are indeed the future, not towards just a healthier environment, but happier people and thicker coffers. Before I end, I'd like to thank the following people: Dr. Pamela Collins, my Conservation International Supervisor. She's brilliant as she is caring, as sharp and analytical as she's fun to talk to. Professor Rose, my IIC Director, but who I will always remember as the first professor who showed me GIS and got me into all of this. Professor Charlie Voris-Marty, whom without his depth of knowledge this project would not happen. Andrew Chamberlain, who also helped me with the data. Dr. David Hole, indispensable. And my colleagues, Kayla Walsh and Dr. Aviva Lowe, who have personally helped me during my coding sessions. And of course, the Charles Center and the IIC, without whom none of this would have happened in the first place. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I'm proud to hold that distinction for you. I want to open the floor to Pamela Collins from Conservation International if she would like to say a few words about this project.
So first off, Rob, thank you so much for inviting CI to be a part of this group. It was a great pleasure working with you, and a very great pleasure working with Vince, who was very thoughtful, very thorough. We've had lots of really great discussions about what it means to automate queries, when, why, how to compare against the needs of projects, how to evaluate the utility of outputs, a lot of really nice critical thinking questions around not only how to make the best code, but then also how to tailor the outputs most efficiently to what the needs are. So those conversations were great fun. I cannot stress enough the fact that basically what we did is we gave Vince our thorniest data set and said, can you please make this more usable for our project? And he did. He delivered in a way that was efficient and cheerful and very effective. So that's been great fun. Yeah, I think that's all. Let's go on to questions.
Thank you, Pam. Erica, do you have some questions?
Yeah, so first question, Vince. Could the low precision project points be better placed using some sort of machine learning tool that combines the type of infrastructure with high resolution imagery?
Yes, this is one of the lines of thinking I've dedicated weeks on. So the idea of using machine learning to figure out where points are using high-res imagery is indeed very attractive. The only issue is it needs a lot of training data, like a lot of training data. And I've combed the internet for documentation on how to use these types of algorithms. The closest I've gone to recreating this was recreating a project on urban sprawl. So a bunch of researchers were able to use high-res imagery to detect urban sprawl in a given city in the United States. They would cut up the city into a grid and measure the change of electromagnetic radiation differences in each grid, and see that using whatever remote sensing satellites they were using, detect the change. There was also a similar method, but instead of using remote sensing, they just used pixels on a 2D picture, which is less effective. However, in all this, it didn't really suit what I needed, because I didn't need to track change. I needed to track, I didn't need to track anything. I need to see that, okay, if the building looks like this, then it's most likely a borehole, or if it looks like this, it's probably a water treatment plant. And in my research, I haven't been able to find such an approach. If any of you out there do know, please let me know, because that would solve a lot of our troubles. So unfortunately, the answer is yes, I've thought about it. I've looked all over the place, but unfortunately, I just couldn't get it to work.
Thank you, Vince. In the interest of time, if anyone has additional questions, please put it in the Q&A, and if we have a moment, we'll come back to them. At this point, we're thrilled to have Thomas Lovejoy joining us as a discussant to summarize these presentations in the greater conservation context. I'll introduce Thomas, but most of you probably already know him or know of him because he's had an incredible impact on conservation. Not only has he coined the term biological diversity, which has shaped the way we think about conservation, but he has a long history and many roles in conservation. He's the president of the Amazon Biodiversity Center, professor in environmental science and policy at George Mason University, a senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation. He has served as the chair for the Heinz Center, a conservation director for the World Wildlife Fund, a biodiversity advisor for the World Bank, served on councils under the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and has received many accolades for his work over the years. We're also incredibly thrilled and appreciative that he has agreed to join the IIC Advisory Board, as his insights and perspectives will enable us to fulfill the IIC mission to leverage innovative research and capacity building to address global conservation challenges. Thomas, I'll hand it over to you. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
So as you can imagine, I dropped into this completely cold, right? This is my first real interface with the IIC, and it was thrilling. So I'm really impressed that each of these projects is a real world project, that each one engages with either an NGO or a government agency. And each one of them has produced incredibly useful data and ways of looking at data. So beyond that, you know, I could get into details of individual projects, but I don't think that's particularly useful here. I think what I've seen is an extraordinarily useful way to engage up and coming young scientists and conservationists in real world problems that will, you know, inform them at the moment, but also I think continue to inform them as they pursue their careers. So I think I probably should leave it at that, but I was really, really grateful to be sitting here listening and watching all of this.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And we, again, really appreciate you joining us today. And again, thank you to all the participants. If you do have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm just going to pass it over to my colleague in the IIC, John Swaddle, for some final words.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a few things right at the end here. First off, the students, you all did amazingly well. It's difficult to present on this type of platform, let alone to articulate complex projects so clearly. And I'm particularly impressed with those of you who did live demonstrations of various different tools. That's pretty amazing to pull off. It's like having 4 different things moving at the same time. I've also like to thank the partners, as Tom Lovejoy mentioned, and as Rob said in the introduction, everything that we want to do with the IIC, we want to do to affect real world conservation outcomes. We want everything to have practical relevance. And we can't do that without partners. So thanks very much to all of the partners who have helped these students this past summer: Rainforest Trust, WCS, CI, US Fish and Wildlife, American Bird Conservancy. And we're looking for more partners. We're looking for more research. Even as we wrap up this summer's set of projects, working and extending them this fall, we're already starting to plan for the summer of 21. So we're always going to be on the lookout for new and interesting projects and new partnerships too as well. So if you're in an organization or you know other people, networks in other organizations, please have them reach out to us. You get a little taste from this summer in terms of the types of projects that students can take on, but we're also looking for perhaps even bigger projects too as well that maybe a cohort of students can work collectively on together as well. So they don't have to only be individual projects. And I hope this has given you a bit of a glimpse for the culture of undergraduate research at William & Mary too as well. Now, this is something that we want to show within the IIC, but it also exists outside the IIC too as well. I think William & Mary is a special institution in that way in terms of the culture of students being encouraged to take on the unknown and to really try to forge and find answers for themselves through various different research projects. And then finally, to thank all the attendees, everyone who showed up today to listen. I hope you've got something out of it. I hope you've enjoyed it. And feel free to follow up with any of us, with any of the presenters, with any of us on the IIC team, Erica and Rob and me, if you have any questions and if you want to continue the conversations later. Thanks again.